Initially focusing on forest protection, Adrian co-founded the Otways Ranges Environmental Network, which was successful in creating the Greater Otway National Park. Later he organised and ran the successful campaign to stop the Nass Valley Dam in the ACT. In 2003, he began campaigning to reverse global warming and went on to found Beyond Zero Emissions, Vote Climate, and later Save the Planet. He has worked for government as a sustainability advisor, as a climate research at Melbourne Uni, and currently works at Ceres as an educator on climate and energy issues.
Great talk, and my heart's out with you. I've just been VCAT, and bizarrely we won. We won at VCAT. It was like we all went. We all walked out thinking we're going to lose, because that's what happens at VCAT. It's about making development happen, pretty much. But for some reason we won, but we're just waiting to see what happens next. They'll probably double the height and win next time. So anyway, and it's an excellent explanation of the population-based Ponzi scheme that we effectively have for economy in this country. And but there's another, in my opinion, slightly darker side to the population issue, beyond its impact on our urban lifestyles and the fact our governments are incapable of running an economy without population growth, and that's our population's impact on the natural environment. In the past, a long time ago, when global populations were small and our technology was simple, our impact on the natural environment was in many ways limited. Yet even then we were still capable of destroying natural ecosystems, sending species to extinction, causing our own relatively localised ecological disasters and population collapses, though some people argue that human migration changed entire landscapes in the past. So,
Adrian, are you going down the slides?
I've only got a few slides, so it's mainly, I'll bring them up when I need to, so thank you. So today the problem is, of course, we're outstripping our natural environment's ability to absorb the impacts that we're causing, and that's occurring on a global scale. And Philip Sutton, a Safe Climate campaigner that I work with, has a lovely graph showing sort of natural resilience declining, and human impact rising, and there's a crossover point, and we're beyond that crossover point. And at some point, the sort of catastrophic disasters people have predicted in the past about human impact on natural environment are likely to occur, and many of them are in train at the moment. So, but if you're at all doubtful that population had an impact, oops, I put them in the wrong order. These are graphs that Professor Will Steffen managed. Have you all heard of Will Steffen? I think he was ANU. He's part of the climate movement now. But there's population up. You notice from 1950 the rough dotted line, it spikes. Urban population spikes, large dam spikes, transportation spikes, telecommunication spikes, water use, paper, industrial tourism, primary energy use, fertiliser consumption, and I've seen other versions which have McDonald's, etc., etc., etc. Everything goes up, right? And it's all stemming from, in part, this. It's a simple causal relationship, and it's almost impossible to deny. Now, to go back a slide, we also just happen to see, and it's not by coincidence, a whole range of ecosystem trends that are negative, responding to that increased population and increased consumption. So there's carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide and methane, three greenhouse gases, stratospheric ozone level, though we did attempt to cut that back a little bit successfully to some degree. Surface temperatures rising, ocean acidification is rising, marine fish captures jumped. They're probably slowing down here because there's just no more fish. Shrimp aquaculture, nitrogen into the coastal zone, tropical forest loss, domestic land domination, and textural degradation. So it's population and environmental degradation is quite causal, but we'll talk a little bit about more of that in a second. And I'll bring that up when we discuss this sort of equation. But let's get back into where I was. So, so simply put, those graphs of Will Steffen's that we showed here before, it's more people wanting more things, having more impact. It's pretty much, that's how simple it is. Now, yet, when we look around the world, almost every country bar a few is increasing their population, and they're doing that naturally, i.e. more births and deaths, and through immigration. Australia is included in that. Australia's population growth, the figure I've got is about 1.5% increasing, which is above the world average of 1.2% and one of the highest in the OECD. And about 55% of that, I think, is immigration. All right, so we've now, and as we've heard, the reason for this is our economics basically. It's the need to maintain growth, because our entire capitalist monetary system is based on constant growth. The moment the growth stops, people can't pay their debts, the system collapses, great suffering, etc., as we've seen in the past. It's cyclical and it's embedded in the very design of the system that we live every day. So the growth is sort of needed, otherwise we end up like that. We'll end up like that at some point anyway, unless we somehow manage to transition out of that cycle. But if we look at Australia's environmental records, such as species extinction rates, land clearing levels, per capita emissions, which constantly put Australia in the top 4 to 10 around the world, depending on which study you see, you look at, we do very, very badly. Okay, so Australia does very, very badly environmentally and still is doing so today. This means, from an environmental perspective, Australia is literally the worst place, or one of the worst places, to put any single person in the world if you're going to put them somewhere. All right? And Victoria, with our use of brown coal, means that our emission profile's much higher than the rest of Australia. So Victoria is the worst place within Australia to put any extra people anywhere in the world, more or less. So, now, given that we're facing environmental catastrophes on a number of fronts, the only time it would make sense to increase population would be if adding that person to your population it basically resulted in a restorative impact. So they were a positive impact to the environment rather than a negative impact. And in theory, maybe one day we could design systems that actually occur, but we're way away from that at the moment. Does everyone understand what I just meant? Like, each person's helping the environment get better. That doesn't happen today. Yet, we look at population and how people think about it in terms of environmental, and if you remember, Tony Abbott in his last days was harping on about Australia's reduction in per capita emissions. And does anyone know how we got reduction in per capita emissions?
Carbon tax?
No, it was, well, that a little bit, but it's mainly because we added more people. The more people you add, if you manage to hold the growth or stabilise the emissions. So Tony Abbott's big claim was, we've got this significant future reduction in per capita emissions because we have a significant future increase in population. It's simple as that. And it was his thing he was using for a bit of positive stuff before he got overthrown. So back to the equation I had up before, the IPAD equation. I'm sure most people will be familiar with this. Yeah. So 1970s, Barry Commoner, Paul Ehrlich, John Holdren. The equation, for people who don't get it, is environmental impact equals population times affluence times technology. Increasing our population and our destructive capacity through technological change and growth in affluence has led to our destructive capabilities increasing. I would add there's another element that's missing from the IPAD equation, and that is S, which is the average stupidity of any population. And it's particularly the type of stupidity where people fail to assess properly the long, medium and short-term measures of any impact, but also the stupidity that creates high levels of belief in people's denial around negative social consequences of particular actions, even though the evidence shows that there will be negative actions and they're connected financially to those negative actions. So it's the sort of certain stupidity that somehow seems to predominate our society, I suspect. But anyway, to recap the IPAD equation, on the causal side, 3 key factors: population, affluence and technology. Most mainstream environmental groups choose largely to focus on T, the technology. In the sense that they seek to reduce technology's impact on the environment, i.e. more efficient cars, houses, solar and wind versus coal. They perceive the potential for a quick fix or immediate reduction in environmental impact, though in reality it may take years, if not decades, to successfully bring about these campaigns. I mean, people have been talking about solar ever since I was a child, right? And now we're seeing the boom. So it's literally 40 years of my personal memory that I remember people talking about, let's get solar out there. So affluence is tackled often in the sense where we're rich enough to preserve this area or this species for its own or our sake, but rarely in the sense that we should rein in consumption in general, except in terms of buy eco-friendly, maybe don't take any overseas trips on a plane, etc. And even less often do people talk about growing inequality and redistribution of wealth. There's a number of exceptions to this, of course, with some lead environmentalists who go beyond this, such as David Suzuki, arguing that affluence beyond a certain measure is purely an indulgence and unnecessary, and David Attenborough publicly talking about population. Why is population not discussed by major NGOs? I suspect there's a range of factors. Perceived implication of criticism of policy and culture of developing countries that have large population growth, similar perceived implication of criticism of people with large families, perceived longer timeframes of getting actual outcomes, even though I argued that technology change often has long timeframes as well. And possible fear to sort of from the wash of World War II, people just talking about all the negatives of eugenics, etc., and getting washed up in racism, etc. So they sort of leave it alone. And there's also the failure of predictions of collapse that were made in the past where population was strongly linked, such as that by Paul Ehrlich himself, when we're all meant to have died by now, and we haven't. So it's the boy who cries wolf syndrome. It's quite a bad thing. So, however, our current state of environment, given the current state of environment, we need to be talking about all of those three causal elements if we're going to actually tackle the problems that we face. So population has to be a part of it. In an emergency, you don't go for half measures, you don't leave major parts of the solution off the table because they're uncomfortable, difficult or problematic. You do it all, and you do it all as best as you can, as much as you can resource. By not including population as one plank of the solutions, ENGOs are ignoring one of the three key drivers that we must tackle. And thus are not really playing to win, but in fact playing to lose in the long game. So, how big is the problem? Today the indicators of the environment impacts are starkly bleak, whether it's massive destruction of our natural environment, the dire state of the world's fish stocks, acidification of our oceans, the ecological footprints analysis suggests that we're using at least 2.5 planets rather than the one we actually have, and global warming, where current levels today of CO2 will mean at some point a 3-degree warming and a 20-metre sea level rise at some future point, unless we reverse it, which would be catastrophic for human society and the world's ecology. So, as an example of the sort of things we face, while at the UN conference in Bali in about 2008, I went to a World and Food Agriculture event. The speaker put up a slide that showed land clearing emissions dropping off steeply after 2015, and we all got excited. We were at an international climate event, and there was something positive on the screen. It's very rare that happens. Someone put up their hand and said, "Oh, we finally stopped land clearing," and the person said, "No, we've just run out of land." Seriously, that was the answer. So, now our collective impacts are so bad that some people consider them the beginnings of the 6th great extinction event to hit our planet history, in our planet's history. And effectively, humans are now the biological equivalent of the asteroid that slammed into the Earth 65 million years ago and wiped out 75% of the world's species. I think there's some graphic you could do with billions of people in a big ball going boom or something like that. But anyway. But let's be honest, we've got a big job to do. It will require global levels of cooperation, innovation on an unprecedented scale. And that's actually the beauty of this diabolical program. To get out of it, we have to work together in an amazing cooperative fashion. It is the potential for the beauty that can come out of solving this is unbelievable. We've changed the world. But it's a big problem. In the 90s, the Dutch government, faced with multiple issues, including sea level rise, local pollution, etc., commenced a government research program to find out what we need to do to get out of the worst of the scenarios. They concluded that we would need a factor 20 increase by over 50 years, so they sort of released around 2000, 2050, or if we wanted to include global equity, a factor 50 increase in inputs, energy and materials, and outputs, pollution, to all human activity. So that means a 95 to 98% reduction in energy and materials on the inside, and 95 to 98% reduction on the stuff coming out, i.e. the pollution. All right, so that level of change is possible, but it would actually require a process of innovation. It's that full on. But we could do it if we actually try. If you sort of try killing each other, and rather than investing all this money in useless war machines, I suspect we could come out quite well. But most people don't want to acknowledge the level of the problem, including most environmental NGOs. Constantly downplaying the problem, or at best, creating cognitive dissonance, or at worst, a severe sense of hopelessness by proposing solutions that are clearly inadequate to solve the problem. Save the Planet campaigner Bryony Edwards calls this soft climate denial, which undermines real action on global warming. Why do NGOs do this? The NGOs do this. They are often trapped in their cycles of lobbying for incremental change that they've been doing literally for decades. Often they might start off as a radical organisation, and pretty quickly they end up being a lobbying organisation. That's the sort of trend. And in the worst case, like WWF, they can end up at times being paid $20 million by the Howard government and undermining the rest of the movement. So it's the sort of thing that happens. Some people still fail to understand the true threat of what we're facing with global warming, and some people believe there's no actual real solutions to it. Okay, and others don't want to scare people. And I'll just try very quickly unpack the last two. There are major climate NGOs in Australia run by people who believe that a technical solution to global warming is impossible, right? Consequently, the goals of these organisations do not represent an attempt to return to safe climate, to save the Great Barrier Reef, the Pacific Islands, or maximise the protection of human life or the natural environment, but rather something that feels organisationally or personally comfortable for the person in charge. Simple as that. Imagine the Pope being an atheist or a mafia boss being chief of police. It just won't work, right? Simple as that. And that's what's happened to our climate movement in some cases. Other commentators such as Jonathan Franzen, I think that's how you say his name, writes articles claiming there is no hope for the future and it's time to give up. Now, if you truly don't believe that we can't avoid a climate catastrophe, I'd really, from a heartfelt position, ask you to shut up. I'd ask you to resign your position and stop writing op-eds or whatever it is. And let those of us who actually believe we can get out of it to get on with the job, because you actually become part of the problem. You become part of the opposite end of the denial movement that comes in from the other side and sort of join together with the people who are actually paid to do the denial. So, not scaring people, just an example. In 2005, 3 fires in Canberra ACT, the government delayed warning people literally to the last 30 minutes, I think, about the imminent impact of a firestorm on the suburbs, on the western side. And people were literally, cars are driving down saying, get out of your house as the fireball hit, the firestorm hit. And Bessabri homes exploded, etc., etc. It was quite terrible, according to the people I talked to who were there. So, one person in response to the Royal Commission said, we have a right to be afraid. Governments cannot hide that, or should not hide that sort of thing from us. They should be honest. And simply put, if we don't tell people what the problem is, they cannot act, right? They cannot act. If you don't give them the information, they cannot act, let alone drive political change. So the don't mention the war attitude, to use a Faulty Towers sort of scene that I like from childhood, attitude of most major NGOs is backed up by numerous papers from marketers and psychologists who explain to us that people do not like hearing about very nasty things that are beyond their immediate control. Well, duh. Of course people don't like that. The question, tell us something we don't know. The question they should be answering is, how do we communicate to people that problem? Not that they don't like it. We know they don't like it. I don't like it. I have trouble sleeping some nights. So, I have a little child, etc., etc. It is tough mentally. But how do we deal with it? So here, communication theory and practice relating to extreme illness may give us some insight. And this was first highlighted to me by a guy I used to work for in the Department of Human Health and Human Services, Dan Enviornment. He's the climate guy. In this case, in extreme illness, you tell the person you're really, really sick, and we're going to do this for you, this is the best we're going to do, and this is your chance of coming out the other end, right? It might be 5%, it might be 14%, it might be 30%, and you just be honest about it. And bizarrely, when you do that, people actually respond. They respond, and they respond well. If you don't tell them that they're really ill, guess what? They don't respond. And if you tell them you're really ill and have this cup of water with a vitamin tablet in it, guess what? They don't respond. All right. So at the moment, the NGOs are saying some aren't saying how bad it is. Some are saying it's pretty bad, but saying let's change the light globe, to coin the phrase in the early days of the climate campaign. And people know changing light globes aren't going to do it when Alcoa uses 30% of our coal energy in Victoria, for example. So where to from here? So given NGOs, sectors largely unwilling to clearly define problems around global warming, etc., will they take on population as a campaigning core? Probably not. So what do we have to do? Well, population stand as a single standalone issue? And I think in the case that you were talking about, Jack, population in the urban setting, people can make really quick links, right? And I think that's an excellent spot for population to be brought directly into the campaigns or even running the campaigns from that perspective, right? From the environmental issue, not so much. Population has to stand with affluence and technology. All three have to come out together, so shoulder to shoulder. Now, from the environmental perspective, what we could do is we could look for what is the next climate movement that's going to take hold. And my argument would be that it's the Climate Emergency Safe Climate campaign that I'm involved in. It's very, very few people work in it. We include population in our discussions, and it's not something that we ignore. But if people got involved in that start of that movement, because ultimately the only logical response or the moral response to climate change is a climate emergency safe climate response. Anything less means we're all in trouble. So if population was included at the start, people got it and maintained it in its framing and its messaging and in its media, etc. By the time the major NGOs come across in 6 to 24 months, the population won't survive because they'll bring with them their reluctance to talk about it again once they engage at the climate emergency level. And then of course there's options for grassroots campaigning. It's just grassroots campaigning 101. Coke has to we all know Coke, the Coke constantly advertises. We have to constantly get our messages out there, whether it's postering, leafleting, lettering. And one thing I thought was a bit disappointing recently was we used to have the Sustainable Population Party that decided to change tact. Previously it was a single issue party giving a clear message, bring it into the fore, it can run all of its logic. It decided to try and run a broad spectrum environmental campaign and bring population in there with it. Sadly, it wasn't executed very well in my opinion. Save the Planet rated its in climate policies, it was rated 6th under Animal Justice Party, the Greens, even Labor, Socialist Alliance, etc. So if you're going to run a sustainable focused party, it has to be the edge. It has to take the entire suite of sustainable policies and be the edge. It's no point just having population and having strong on that and weak everything else below the level of the Labor Party, literally ridiculous. You need to have the whole suite of environmental policies really strong, and then you can be moderate on all your other social issues. You can go centrist on everything else to try and get broader appeal. But on your whole package, you need to have the whole package strong. So, and the Animal Justice Party is one example of really effective campaigning on single issues. Their increasing vote has literally resulted in real outcomes for them in a number of jurisdictions because they go in there, they campaign on the issue, and they push votes around. So a basic lesson of politics, unless you are moving votes, you are not campaigning politically. You are educating the public, right? Unless you move votes from one party to the other. And the failure of the environment movement, essentially when I look back over my years and years of campaigning, is that we have always gone Green, then Labor, then Liberal, right? If you always preference in the same pattern, you have no power. You've instantly taken yourself out of the equation. What we really need, maybe one exciting thing that happens in the future, it's appealing to me, is if the Liberals pull out of the Green Labor seats, maybe there's an opportunity for a soft Liberal Party, not the hard right-wing nutbags type Liberal Party, to re-emerge under a new banner, separate people, but be strong on environment. So environmentalism isn't left or right, it's just a suite of policies that can be captured by any political persuasion, from Nazi extremists to communists to anyone in between. Pre-1960s, who were the conservatives? Who actually made national parks? Who was it? Liberals and Nationals, that's who did it, right? And then with the hippies, Labor took it on as part of its suite. Does that sort of make sense? But does Labor actually give us what we want? No. Now they've been smashed in Northcote last weekend, maybe we'll actually see a new national park or something. But will that solve climate change? No, we've got much more to do. Anyway, I'm pretty much over time, so hopefully I've given you some insights or some excitement or something like that. So happy to answer some questions. And that's global warming trajectories, by the way. And clearly we're not following this one, we're following that one. And the moment we start getting into this sort of temperature range, it's game over. You know, pretty much, as far as we can tell. It gets very scary for much of the world's population. And once the world's population or society start unravelling, we talk in regional wars, starvation, someone might go nuclear, etc., etc. Thank you.
Now, Adrian, I might get you to stay there.
Yeah.
Jack, do you mind coming to the front again, just so we have about just under 15 minutes of Q&A. I will stop Q&A at 4 o'clock. Mark, do you want to turn that off if you can? Let's see how you do it. But please hang around at 4 o'clock because we do have tea and coffee, and then you can talk one-on-one with Adrian or Jack or small groups. So, look, does anyone want to open up with a first question? Try to make questions succinct as well, because I'm sure we all want to ask questions. So, we've got Martin, then Jenny, then Isabel. Yeah.
Jack, tell me, with your membership of 600, what proportion of those we actually do explicitly against population growth and understand a large part of it's immigration, so it's therefore legal and family control? How many people really believe population growth should be stopped and they're not racist about it?
There's quite a few of our members that are critical of our push against population growth.
Why?
I don't know whether there's a religious aspect to it, but I think there is. There's quite a few people from the Catholic Church that have pulled out. I suspect that's the reason. How much we influence them, I mean, I've been hammering them pretty hard, but I think they've got the message, but people like you, it's apathy.
Well, so I'm interested this week. We had a bit of a discussion with Mary Ross for the steps of Parliament around them. You know, very commonly there's other things to say afterwards, but I imagine, I understand quite a few complaining backlash groups who are very much opposed to mentioning population growth.
Correct.
In terms of
there was a hardcore group that
is it a group or who is it? Can we understand a bit more about this, because it's extraordinary in this day and age that people won't discuss population growth in terms of complaining.
it was one of the speakers that influenced the push to not talk about population growth.
I'll ask you later.
It's in an article on Can Do Better. I have the proof of it.
Yeah, we know it happened. I'm just trying to work
No,
out.
I filmed it and I documented who stopped them from talking.
Okay.
And I s- yeah.
Is that person ideologically right-wing,
Sorry?
conservative Christian Catholic? Was this person that
No, they
objected?
were from a group down in Ormond or somewhere down there, I'm not sure. I don't know.
I
Groups
reckon
are
they were
influenced by the
developing
people who
links.
lead them.
Like,
If they have an agenda, the group tends to follow that agenda, so it's hard to pin it down. But I know that when I talk about population growth, people say, oh, you're just a racist. And my response is not about race, it's about numbers. If they can't work that out, they're stupid.
No, but have you been across Kathy Betts's latest surveys on ignorance in Australia of the demographic numbers? Because it's like when you tell people that actually 60% of our population growth for the last 10 years has come from immigration, a lot of people don't know that. Suddenly you get a leap of 20% with further opposition to immigration.
Yeah.
I mean, underneath the inertia of public opinion, people just do not know the demographic numbers. In fact, the growth lobby keeps hiding it from them.
It's hard to get the numbers. I don't know how you get on, but I find getting the numbers about population growth is very hard. And you've taken me to task for it. But I get it from the immigration department as much as I can.
oh no, the ABS is much clearer.
But it's confusing.
It really is difficult. I know, because I used to teach this stuff and tell the students to go to the ABS website and it's all there. And it
No,
is all
I don't
there.
go near ABS.
It is all there, but you've got to be clued up to be able to find it and interpret it. And then, of course, the immigration numbers are a little bit different, and you've got to understand why that's so. And there's a good political sociologist in America, Gary Freeman, who has written a splendid article about this. And he says, for most people, it pays to be rationally ignorant. The information, and he's talking about the United States, which is where he is, the information is really hard to get hold of, really hard to understand, so you've got to put a lot of effort into it. And if you start carrying on about it too long, people will say you're racist. So he says it's rational to remain ignorant.
To answer your question, I suspect, I would guess that about 60-70% of our members would be on side. I'd say 20% probably don't care, and that there'd be probably 10% that dead against. That's the feel I get.
You would say 10. You would say
Sorry, Martin. 10%.
10.
10%.
Jenny, what's your question?
Just talking about iPad. People seem to think, a lot of people think that technology is going to solve all our modern problems and will let us increase our affluence and our population. I think we need to somehow get beyond that and seeing technology, yes, it can really work for us, but in a way that we need to see it in a bigger picture, that it doesn't mean that we can increase our affluence and our population. It just seems to be a bit bizarre. People think, oh, this is going to solve all our problems. Fantastic. We can keep populating as much as we like. We can have all these new whiz-bang things because we can live it up because the technology's there. And I'm thinking, hang on a minute, we need to look at technology as a tool, not as a solution.
Yeah, and until we're way off way off that point where adding a person is a regenerative factor, and until we get there, like every person is a critical drag on the system, and we're pushing it so close to the edge now. And you can ring up, like, I talked to the head of the Cairns Environment Council or something up there, and they were talking about how they don't bring up the fact that most of the reef in the north is dead now. It's like it's dead. And they don't talk about it because they don't want tourists to come and go, well, you're the environment thing, you're not the tourist bureau. You've got to talk about it, otherwise there will be no recovery. The bleaching events are now occurring too quickly. And they said, oh, but we can't talk about it, then the tourists won't come. I said, but you'll lose the reef, like, and that's it, it's all over. And there's just this amazing ability for complete logical, internal deception goes on.
Living in a lie, basically.
Yeah.
We're living a lie. We're just not living in the present. We're not living the truth. I'm thinking, and that's why we're heading in that terrible direction because we can't see it. The politicians have all got blinkers and blindfolds on.
Yeah, and part of it, for me, the critical role is that I feel the soft denialism is really critical of the ENGOs. And I went up to Christine Milne years ago. I resigned my position after I stopped the dam. I got put on climate change and got told to campaign for 60% by 2050. And I said to my boss, that's a death sentence to the planet. I cannot stand up and publicly argue for that. Why? Here's all the science, bang. Arnold Schwarzenegger's done 80%, can I at least be Arnie Schwarzenegger? It's... And I lobbied the Greens, and the Greens Christine knew exactly what we needed to do. We had to go backwards back then in 2005 or 6, when it was. And she said, oh, we can't lead. And I said, why? Why? And because people think the Greens tell the truth, or they think Greenpeace tells the truth. Or, we might not know that, but the broader people don't, and you're going, Jesus Christ. Well, not Jesus Christ, but sure.
Isabel, you had a question, and then we've got Sheila.
Do you have any suggestions of how we could have got more people to these meetings? It's such a tiny little speck of the population. Could it have been maybe old-fashioned ways of letting people know that we're having
We're in the same boat on the climate emergency side, so we can't even get people who run on climate change. It's taken us years just to bring them around to the climate emergency position, and then they'll step backwards and talk long goals and weak targets again. So I don't know. I don't know. I reckon door knocking maybe. I just having those personal discussions.
Just appealing to people's self-interest.
Whatever they're interested in, if you can make that the basic sales technique, is you find out what someone cares about and link it to your issue, whatever that is. So if it's cars or driving to work, it's traffic. If it's future for their kids, it's something else.
Of letting them know that this, for example, that this was on today. Is internet the best way, or could it also help to put out little slides on if there are any notice boards anymore?
We have exactly the same problem, and I think there's some huge. I think subconsciously everyone knows that we're in deep shit, and consequently there's this huge reticence to be engaged. Because the moment you engage, it changes your life. Like, what's the whole point? Why are my kids doing degrees or doing school or whatever? Because in 15 years' time, then they may not be a structure to support, whatever. But it's just, I think people hold back, even personal friends and family.
But they have kids, aren't they scared for their children?
But I think we've got actually far easier sell than Adrian, because Adrian's asking for dramatic changes in people's lives that are part of climate emergency, whereas Adrian's saying literally anything. You can talk about traffic, you can talk about housing, affordability, like population is linked to so many issues. It's the ultimate cause, but not the proximal cause. Approximately people like, oh, there's too many cars, and I wish there was less cars. But that's only the proximal cause. The ultimate cause is the population of so many issues that people whinge about.
Okay, Sheila, I think this might be a second last question. We've got some community announcements.
Hi, Adrian. I found your delivery really very effective, but there's something that doesn't seem to be factored into climate change emissions counts, and that's the contribution of the war machine. We've got countries that are actually being turned to cinders continuously, in the Middle East, for instance, and in South America, and it seems not to be even spoken about. Do you know what proportion of emissions comes from continuous wars?
No, I haven't seen that. But I mean, there's a lot of errors in the current accounting models. Like, you know, one big one's the impact of animal emissions. So if you look at the impact of methane in the here and now, not spread out over 100 years, in the 10 years or 12 years that's actually in the atmosphere from the time it's released, and redo all the figures, you find that, surprise, surprise, agriculture rises up to equal to the coal industry. Right?
Yeah.
Like equal. So, you know, the easiest thing we could do is stop eating cows, beef, lamb and dairy, and bang, a huge chunk of methane production drops out of the system, and we have an immediate impact over 10 years of reducing the heat for warming, you know. So, look, like, it's
But if you're continuously dropping bombs,
like
guns, why penalise a bunch of animals?
I know, but I brought up the issue of the war machine and the investment in it that is completely false. That is the waste of money that we all have globally, and we could live in the most beautiful world if the war machine hadn't captured the politics of particularly America and their philosophy of imperialism. So, you know, we literally could live in a beautiful world, but we have to win.
One more thing to say, you were talking about how just about every country in the world is growing.
Yeah.
But in fact, there's the Western continental Europe, it just hasn't been growing with the same massive immigration as the Anglosphere. And they also take fairly seriously attempts to environmental politics and so on, because they actually feel they're doable, but they are really unaware of the state of population growth, propaganda and mass migration in the Anglosphere. And I find most environmentalists are not aware. They look at the globe and they say, oh, everybody's doing this, but in fact, there's a completely different system, at least two systems. And we should be aware of that, because that contains some answers.
Yeah, and I recently had a Polish house guest, and I was quite surprised how openly hostile he was to immigration and race and various things. And I think that as time goes on, if we don't tackle these problems nicely, it will end up being a nasty response to the whole thing. And
I don't think there's a nasty response. They just don't. They cost their housing and infrastructure to the state. It's not privatised.
And look,
our growth system makes a profit.
And look, and I'd love to go and live in Sweden or Finland or something, but I've just chosen to stay here at a young age because I wanted to fight the fight where I live. So, you know, and I think that, you know, I thought we could run a political party called the Norwegian model or something like that. You know, it's like, it could get votes, but it's like, yes, I agree. Like, it's all good. I mean, we're at a real crossroads with corruption in politics now. Like, both sides, whether it's Liberal or Labor, are just complete crap. Like, and we really need to get some grassroots stuff over. I mean, Matthew Guy, when he sold off all that land, rezoned the land and allowed private individuals to capture massive amounts of state wealth by state decision, which is criminal, criminal. But it's like, and I'm sure there's a huge kickback loop from that process spread over time.
They're all in it.
Yeah, they're all in it. So I think our political class has just got so corrupted that we need to really work hard to kick them out. And even, look, to be honest, even the Greens, like I was a Green And on my term as convener, we had branch stacking, we had individuals trying to control selections by vetoing people that come in on the boards, and all that stuff continues today. And it's tragic because you think, you go, where's the golden ray of light coming? But it's just a battle, and with population, I think if we're going to do better and include a simple 4 dot points, and we talk about reversing global warming, zero emissions drawdown, population, and a new economic system. That's going to be our 4 dot points for Save the Planet, and that's going to be on all our posters. So the more we get out there, the more people just mention it as an issue, the more okay it is for people to come to things like this as well. Like, if we have to make it a thing again, that's okay to talk about.